When we think of saints, we often picture models of perfection, brilliant theologians, fearless martyrs, charismatic leaders, and then there's Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He was none of those things. In fact, by almost every worldly measure of his time, he was considered a failure. He was the saint who seemed to get everything wrong, except the one thing that mattered most. He was born Giuseppe d'Assa in 1603, in a small village in Cupertino, Italy. His childhood was marked by poverty and hardship. But more than that, it was marked by a kind of profound simplicity that people mistook for dullness. He was absent-minded, easily distracted, and slow to learn. His mother often found him just staring off into space, and she would scold him, calling him bocca aperta, open-mouthed, because of his tendency to stand there with his mouth hanging open in wonder. He struggled in school. He struggled to learn a trade. He seemed to have no talent for anything practical. His family life was difficult. His father was a poor carpenter who died before Giuseppe was born, leaving the family in debt. Creditors hounded them, and at one point, young Giuseppe was even evicted from his own home. He grew up with this sense of being an outsider, a burden. He tried joining the Franciscans as a lay brother, but they sent him away. He tried the Capuchins, and they actually accepted him. But it didn't last. His clumsiness was legendary. He would drop stacks of plates. He would forget tasks as soon as they were given. He was so prone to ecstatic prayer that he'd leave his work unfinished, standing frozen in the kitchen or the garden. The Capuchins, frustrated, dismissed him. They called him Brother Ass, seeing no spiritual potential, only a useless, bumbling young man. So there he was, a teenager, back home with his mother, seemingly rejected by God and man alike. He had no prospects, no future. He was, by all accounts, a hopeless case. But his mother, in her desperation, pulled some strings. She managed to get him accepted as a servant, a stable hand, for a community of conventual Franciscans. This was his last chance. He wouldn't be a brother, just a menial laborer, tending to the animals and doing the most humble chores. And for Joseph, this was paradise. Freed from the pressure of having to be intellectually gifted or manually skilled, Joseph found his calling in humility. He did the dirtiest jobs with a joyful heart. He cared for the monastery's mule as if it were a gift from God, and he prayed, constantly. His inner life, which seemed so disconnected from the practical world, began to flourish in secret. The very simplicity that made him a failure in the eyes of the world made him perfectly open to the divine. He had no ego to get in the way, no intellectual pride. His mind was a blank slate, ready to be filled only with love for God. The Franciscans, seeing his profound piety and humble service, eventually decided to admit him as a lay brother. There was still the enormous hurdle of ordination to the priesthood. To become a priest, he had to pass exams. And Joseph, who could barely read or remember a lesson, was terrified. The story of his examination is one of the most charming in saintly lore. When the time came for his oral exam, the bishop, by chance or divine providence, opened the Bible to a single random passage. It was a passage from the Gospel of Luke that Joseph knew by heart and loved deeply. He spoke about it with such moving, simple eloquence that the bishop was astonished. For his next exam, the examiner happened to ask him only about the one theological topic he understood perfectly. It was as if the entire universe was conspiring to clear a path for this simple soul. He was ordained in 1628, and then the extraordinary phenomena began. This is what Saint Joseph of Cupertino is most famous for: levitation. They weren't small hops. He would float high in the air, sometimes for long periods, during Mass, or while praying, or even at the sound of a beautiful hymn or the name of Jesus or Mary. The first recorded instance happened in his hometown church. He saw a statue of the Blessed Mother and, overcome with love, just rose up into the air and flew to her feet like a bird. On another occasion, during a papal blessing in Rome, he levitated before the Pope himself. These events were not secret. They were witnessed by hundreds of people over decades, by peasants, by bishops, by skeptics, and by scientists. They were so frequent and so disruptive to the order of the monastery that, for the last 35 years of his life, His superiors forbade him from saying Mass in public, joining choir, or eating in the common refectory. He was, in a sense, quarantined by his own holiness, because his ecstasies were so uncontrollable. He would float over the altar, he would float in the dining hall. Once, he saw workers putting up a large cross on a hillside, and zealous to help, he flew 60 feet through the air to assist them. Now it's easy to get fixated on the spectacle, the supernatural circus act. But the levitations were merely the outward physical symptom of an inward spiritual reality. Joseph was so utterly consumed by the love of God that the laws of the physical world seemed to momentarily suspend for him. His ecstasies were not sought. They were inflicted upon him by the overwhelming presence of the divine. He was embarrassed by them. He would beg God to make them stop, to let him pray in secret without causing a scene. But he had no control over it. His body simply followed where his spirit went. His life wasn't all floating, of course. He lived a life of severe penance, fasting, and poverty. He had a deep devotion to the poor and would give away anything he had. But his greatest suffering was the isolation. Being separated from community, being treated as a strange phenomenon, being investigated by the Inquisition, which he was multiple times, only to be found perfectly sound in doctrine and humility. He was moved from monastery to monastery to avoid public attention, living much of his life in a hidden obscure obedience. He died in 1663, and on his deathbed, he heard the sound of bells from a nearby church. He asked what they were for. He was told it was the Feast of the Ascension, the feast celebrating Christ rising up, body and soul, into heaven. He smiled and said, "Oh, that's beautiful. The Ascension." And then, with his last breath, he uttered, "The donkey is starting to climb the mountain, brother ass." The clumsy failure was finally going home. He was canonized in 1767, and he is the patron saint of a very specific group: aviation. Astronauts, pilots, and students taking exams. The connection for aviators is obvious. But for students, it's profoundly comforting. He is the saint for those who feel unprepared, who are terrified of failure, who feel like their minds go blank. He is the patron of the hopeless cases. He reminds us that God's economy is upside down. The world values intelligence, talent, and success. God values humility, love, and a heart open in wonder. Joseph had nothing to offer but that open mouth, that Bakaperta stare of awe. And God took that simple offering and lifted him, quite literally, to the heights of sanctity. So the story of Saint Joseph of Cupertino isn't really a story about flying. It's a story about grace. It tells us that holiness is not a reward for our accomplishments. It is a gift given to those who know they have nothing to give in return. It's for the clumsy, the forgetful, the ones who drop the plates, the ones who feel like they're always disappointing everyone. Your weakness, your very inadequacy might just be the empty space where God can finally enter in and do something extraordinary. You just have to be open to it. You just have to stand there, open-mouthed in wonder, and let it happen.